Some of the stories you're about to hear, they may be true, and they may terrify you. Just know this, think twice before you go camping in the woods alone. At times, I regret going into that forest. At times, I'm amazed. My story starts a few years ago in September of 2007. I drove out into a distant forest in my home state of Oregon. I walked for about an hour and decided that it was probably far enough. I looked up to the bright blue sky. I closed my eyes, taking in the sweet scent of the pine trees. As I was setting up my small tent, the forest, typically filled with soft chirps of birds and bugs, went silent. I knew from experience that it meant a predator was nearby. Maybe there was a cougar, or perhaps a bear. Setting my tools down on the ground, I looked around. There didn't seem to be anything there, so I continued to put up my tent. The sun had almost set by the time I finished. The woods weren't quiet anymore. Whatever had been there was gone now. In the distance, I could hear water. I grabbed my fishing rod and followed the sound and found a river. It was about 7 feet wide. I sat there for a few hours, fishing in wonderful silence. As I was walking back to my campsite in the dark, preparing to cook my dinner, I froze. Everything had gone silent again, and I could hear something moving quickly through the brush. I couldn't see anything though, because I hadn't set a fire yet. The only source of light I had was a weak, dim little flashlight. While the forest was still quiet, I put my fish into my cooler and started a small fire to cook the rest. The only noise to drown out the deafening silence was the crackling of the fire and the sizzling of the fish. Snap. A few yards from me, I could hear footsteps. They didn't seem human though, but they didn't seem like an animal either. Whatever it was just outside the ring of my fire. Slowly, a tall creature with arms that reached down to its legs hobbled into view. It had pinkish skin, and its eyes were blacker than tar. It was thin, too, and looked like it was starving. It crept closer to me. A feeling of dread had washed over me. I couldn't move. It opened its mouth wider than I thought was physically possible. My shirt and face were drenched in a cold sweat. The thing came up closer and closer, extending one of its arms toward me, probably ready to grab me. I wanted to grab my hunting knife, but I couldn't move. Suddenly, an unholy screech rang out through the night, and something about the demeanor of the creature had changed. It started smiling, almost as if it were telling me, "You got lucky," then shuffled away. I found I was able to move again and scrambled to gather my things. I didn't care about whatever else was lurking out there, I just wanted to get away. I frantically dug through my bag, then let out an exacerbated sigh. My compass was gone. I wouldn't be able to find my way back to my truck without it. I would have to wait till morning to leave. It's been years since that day. When I didn't return as scheduled, I was reported missing by my sister. I was found wandering the highway, despondent. And to this day, only her and a select few people believe my story. The thought of going back to that forest still scares me, and I never enter the woods without a firearm now. I don't know why the creature left that night, and I don't know what would have happened if it didn't. All I know is that the forest is a dangerous place. There are things in there that humans could never comprehend. I once worked as a housing inspector. A new client had purchased a house and I was tasked to go and inspect it. From the information on hand, the house was pretty old, built in 1908, and was quite the derelict. I was in no real hurry to inspect this house, so I scheduled it for my last stop of the day. I did my jobs as per normal and then made my way to the house. I parked my car on the road, and as I walked up to the path, nothing extraordinary jumped out at me. It was a run-down 3-story home. For me, it was just your run-of-the-mill wreck. I guess the buyer had walked through and seen some potential in the home, but I could see pretty much nothing. It was getting on to dusk, and as I didn't have the key for the front door, I made my way around to the rear of the property to access the rear door. As I came around to the back of the house, I noticed that the back door itself opened into a large kitchen. What caught me at this point in time was that the sun had begun to set behind me. I could feel a drastic change of the air temperature. It was late summer, and I assumed that the sun setting was the reason for the drop in the temp. I turned to look at the sunset, noting that the cloud cover gave the sky a nice crimson hue. I turned back toward the door, and that's when I saw it. On the other side of the kitchen was a door that led into a hallway, which in turn led to the front door. The front door had colored glass, but what was standing in the darkness of the hallway, to this day, still makes my hairs stick up on the back of my neck. There was a silhouette of a man. Judging from the build, I could tell it was a man. There was no distinguishing features to see, just a black silhouette. What happened next froze me on the spot. Where his face was, two eyes opened up, and they were colored red. Unblinking and unmoving, those eyes glowed red, and I could tell they were looking right at me. At first, I couldn't look away. Those red orbs seemed to stare straight into my soul, and I found myself transfixed, staring back. Every fiber in me told me I should run, but I couldn't move. I stared, unblinking at the red eyes, and they in turn stared unblinking back at me. My eyes began to water, and I blinked to clear them, but as soon as I opened them again, the silhouette was gone. I freaked. I quickly ran out the house, jumping into my car, and sped home. What would have normally taken me 25 minutes took me actually about 10. In my report, I wrote that the house had some structural issues that couldn't be remedied, so the house was eventually torn down. In its place is now a small housing unit with 6 3-bedroom homes. I've heard stories from tradesmen who had been on site at night, and all have said that they felt a cold chill everywhere they went. I did look up the history of the property, but nothing unusual jumped out at me. Up to that point in my life, I had never really believed in the supernatural or the paranormal. Even now, I'm skeptical of most things. But I know what I saw was pure evil, and I've never had an encounter like that again. In 2016, despite how cliche this might sound, I was working as a private investigator in Oregon. Most people, they make the stereotype that private detectives and investigators have walk-in clients, but that's simply not true. I get almost all my clients from over the phone, and the call I got that June was no exception. The client, a man named Jonathan Alexander, was calling about the disappearance of his father, Nathan Alexander. Jonathan's father had gone missing ever since a solo deer hunting trip in the backwoods of our little Oregon town. And the search parties and official parties hadn't really turned up with anything. In most cases like this, you're looking for a body in the woods, not a living person. But Jonathan was hopeful, so I gave him the benefit of the doubt, and for this case, I took my go bag. Its contents were a bottle of water, a first aid kit, my revolver, a handful of Ziploc bags, my wallet, phone, and food. This part of Oregon was stocked full of cougars, mountain lions, bears, wolves, all sorts of things. And almost everyone carried a heavier firearm when going into the backwoods. The first place on my schedule was Jonathan's house, where I would meet him in person and have an interview. As I pulled up into his dirt driveway, I got a sense of what type of person he was. His house was a 25-foot trailer stuck to the ground, with a backyard and patio facing the mountains. "Are you Jonathan?" I asked the man waiting for me. He was tall, at least 6'5", and wearing a checkered button-up and a trucker hat and jeans. "Yeah," he replied. "You're Inspector Jacob, right? Come inside, I'll tell you the details. I also have some things that could help you, depending on how willing you are." I walked inside the trailer, and the interior was pretty much as I expected. The walls were lined with taxidermied bass and catfish, as well as several deer heads and a rifle propped up on display. A dirty kitchen with a pile of dishes was on one corner and a small 2-person dining table on the other. Jonathan and I sat down. He offered me a beer, but I declined. I never drank on a job. I started with the normal questions. Where was he last seen? Who was with him? What happened leading up to the night of the disappearance? John replied, telling me the whole story. My dad, Nathan, is a hunter and a fisherman. Hunting and fishing's his life. He's always had a rifle and a fishing rod. He's in his 60s and he was in the military for 7 years. Had a few tours in Afghanistan. On that night, he wanted to go solo buck hunting in the evening, so I dropped him off on a dirt road near his favorite spot. He didn't come back for 2 days. This was somewhat normal. He sometimes hunted overnight, or just got lost. After a week passed, I started to get kind of worried. I could feel that something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. I called the sheriff and they organized a search party for 3 nights. We went in pretty much every direction and covered the ground. And you know what? Not a single thing. Not a candy bar, no footsteps leading up to his spot, no trail, nothing. After they declared him deceased, I went out for myself though. I knew he was still out there. I know it. You mentioned a dirt road? Where is it? Jonathan marked the road on the GPS of my phone, and I thanked him and left. I had a no solve, no pay rule, so I wouldn't get paid unless I actually found Nathan, dead or alive. My next stop was at the sheriff's office, in the middle of my small town. I drove past multiple roadside stores until I reached the parking lot of the sheriff's office. I parked and walked into the place, going up to the front desk where a tall, skinny deputy was doing paperwork and chewing gum. I told him that I was looking into the disappearance of Nathan, and he sent me to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a balding man in his 50s named Clyde, showed a forced smile as I walked inside. A stained American flag was pinned to the wall, along with dozens of missing person posters. "So, is this guy a missing friend of yours?" "Nope," I replied. "A client of mine wants me to find him. Nathan, he's the guy's dad." "Well, you're in luck," Clyde replied. "We haven't gotten much criminal activity, so I can show you some of the reports." Clyde reached into his desk and pulled out a stack of papers and photos. One of the photos captured an image showing a trail of footprints ending abruptly. "And what's with this?" I asked. "It's the strangest part of the case. The footprints leading to Nathan's favorite hunting spot just stopped. No trail leading somewhere else, no tire tracks, no ATV tracks, nothing. It's like he just vanished into thin air. But there was this one thing we found of interest." "Okay, and what was it?" "There was a pattern. Every time we checked a place, we heard Nathan's radio coming from somewhere. But it was faint. Could barely hear it. And another strange thing was when we went to search for him, the entire area went dead silent. All the birds and animals, everything. Not even a cricket. As soon as we left, though, sounds came back." This is where I knew that this case was going to be a hard one. But why would they have just given up the search if they heard Nathan's radio? It was about early evening. After jotting down all the notes I could gather, I thanked the sheriff and left. My next stop, the woods. By the time I pulled up to the dirt road in my pickup truck, it was well into getting dark. This wasn't the ideal time for me to be searching through the area and finding clues, but every detective knows how important the first 45 hours are. The place was exactly as John had described it. It was extremely rural and just a few miles away from the mountain range. The forest should have been alive with nature and making all sorts of sounds, but the night was dead. I found Nathan's footsteps from when he was last seen and started combing through the area. Just like Clyde and Jonathan had said, the trail stopped abruptly. Nothing. No other signs that Nathan was even there. It was as if he had just vanished. And it was at this moment, suddenly, I heard rustling behind me. It was fully dark by now, and nobody should have been there beside me. The sound came again, except now it was in front of me, but just out of reach of my headlamp. "Who's there?" I yelled. "Show yourself. I'm armed." Suddenly, something tapped me on my right shoulder. I didn't have time to pull out my gun, and considering that whoever was doing this was probably some drunk guy or some kids messing with me, I wouldn't need it. I turned and threw a punch in that thing's direction, and ended up hitting a tree, nearly breaking my wrist. My knuckles were actually bleeding. Whoever was behind me, if there was someone, they're long gone. And that was when the laughing started. Actually, it was more like cackling. Weird, crazy, and unnatural cackling. Whatever you would call it, it was unsettling. I pulled out my revolver designed to draw bears and fired a deafening shot into the air. The sounds stopped, and I almost put my guard down. Then I heard something whisper just an inch from my ear, and it said, "Leave." My eyes shoot open, and fear courses through my body. I hear the sounds of millions of running footsteps catching up to me. I ran like hell. I ran right out of the woods, fast enough to outrun Usain Bolt. I jumped into the pickup truck and peeled out of there, all in record time. Whatever was behind me was still chasing me, behind the car. I looked in the rearview mirror to spot what it was, but whatever it was running at least 40 miles per hour. I tried to figure out what it was, but I saw nothing. Well, I mean, it wasn't a conceptual nothing. It was nothing in the sense that it was nothing my brain could comprehend or even understand. There was a huge, blurry shape running after me, dark at night and fuzzy around the edges. The best way I could explain this is imagine a bear chasing you, but on top of the bear was a giant mass of static from an 80s TV. I kept driving until I reached town, and eventually it left me alone. I parked at a gas station, hopped out, and immediately threw up. The next day, I headed out to go see a woman named Meredith. I had heard about her from when I was at the bar the night I had seen that sketchy thing. Some paranormal junkies who were very interested in what I had told them recommended me to go see Meredith. Apparently, she owned a spiritual massage shop at the edge of town, having the shop based on the first floor of her house. She also knew a thing or two about the paranormal, including the occult, monsters, ghouls, you name it. I pull up into the driveway of her shop and knock on the door. "We're closed, asshole," somebody, probably Meredith, yelled. I looked at the store hours taped at the front door. Today was a Friday, and according to her on her sign, she was in fact open. "According to your sign, you're open," I said. I could hear her groan and open the triple locked door. In person, she was a short Latina woman with long black hair and a black hoodie covered in all sorts of symbols. "What do you want?" she asked. "Well, what I want to know is what's in those woods. I was told you study the paranormal and supernatural, or am I wrong?" "Nope, you're not wrong." "Good, because yesterday I got bullied and chased by some weird demon thing through the woods. I was looking for a missing man." Meredith's face went pale, and by the looks of it, she knew exactly what I was talking about. "Come in. I might be able to help you." Her place was riddled with plants, as well as shelves stocked full of beakers and test tubes, and a few bags full of strange powders. I sat down on a worn couch while Meredith assessed my situation. "First of all, who told you about me?" she asked. "Well, it was some British guy named Ron at this bar, but then again, I was drunk, so maybe it wasn't Ron, maybe it was like John or something like that." "Okay, well, what did this thing look like?" "Well, it was big, dark, blurry. Couldn't actually see it since it was at least 100 feet away. But it was running pretty damn fast. Like really fast. It was keeping up with my car. And it was probably about 10 feet tall, maybe." "Did you look directly at it?" Meredith asked. "No. I looked at it through the rearview mirror, and even then I couldn't really see it that well." "Must be why you're alive." "What? What do you mean by that?" I asked. "What you just described is what we in the business call a nagalaku." A what?" "He, she, whatever nagalaku is ancient. Has been in the woods for probably over a century, and no one knows where he came from. You said that you were looking for a missing guy, right? Well, Nagalaku probably took him. Nagalaku might even eat him, or might let him go, or might keep him for eternity. I don't really know." I asked her how I could deal with the thing, and she said this: "You probably can't, but whatever you do, don't look directly at her, or the terror itself will kill you." Okay, well, I don't know if I believe in all that, but is there something else that might be able to help me? Something a little more practical? Ah, yes, actually, yes, I do have something. She hands me a pouch of white ashes. I look at the sack in my hands with a bit of irritation. It's like some sort of sick joke, or she thinks that this is some type of game. I got out of there and drove to the gas station where I planned to get my supplies and hunt Nagalakapaka or whatever it was down and find Nathan Alexander. While filling up at the gas station, one of my good friends, John, arrived. I was pretty eager to finish this case, but I wasn't stupid. I would never go back to those woods by myself again. So I called him up to see if he had any interest in checking things out with me. Him being a former Marine, he, of course, only had one answer: say less. After putting everything in my vehicle, we took off. A few hours later, just as the sun was setting, John and I got out of my pickup truck in front of the woods. John had brought his 12 gauge packed with Dragon's Breath incendiary rounds. Don't ask me how he got this, I still don't know. Marines are a weird group of people. The plan was we would go to the woods to spot where I had last been attacked by the weird, tall, scary man and wait. It was getting dark, very quick. "Ready?" John asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just don't shoot me by accident." We crept, and after a mile or so, I reached the spot where Nathan was last seen. We sat there and waited an hour or so until all the noises suddenly stopped, and I heard the sound of something massive dragging across the forest floor. Its voice reached us. John and I both fired shots in the direction of the voice, and although my bullets missed by a mile, the old man's shot was a direct hit. Even though it was dark, I saw it all. I saw the light from the blast of fire and sparks from his shotgun, and without a doubt, it hit whatever it was. The thing screeched, and we moved back a few steps, still blind from the darkness. That's when, without warning, the ground opened beneath us. We both fell into a cavern beneath us. It was at least 6 feet. "You okay?" I asked. "My ass," John replied. "What is this place?" I looked around and tried to figure out where we were, and turns out we were in some sort of weird, crazy tunnels. "Anyone there? Help!" a voice screamed. We ran down the tunnel and searched, and we found a man lying on the cave floor with broken legs. It was Nathan. "We've been looking for you, and we're going to get you out of here," I said. That's when I heard a screech come from the entrance to the tunnel, and then I could hear the monster crawl down, even though it was distant. We sat there in fear, holding our guns up. We sat there for hours. We were there for so long that eventually the sun came up. After daytime had hit, we were found by a group of hunters. They had apparently found the hole and investigated. John and I had suffered some minor wounds, but the missing guy, Nathan, came out pretty much harmless besides the broken legs. The redneck family that had found us dragged us all the way to their pickup truck, then drove us to the hospital, where we would all be treated for our injuries. Nathan was reunited with his family after his long disappearance, and Jonathan paid me in the thousands with the money I didn't expect him to have. When I went back to the place where Nathan had disappeared and my friend John blew away in Nagalaku, I found nothing. No hole, no blood, no casings from our weapons either. It was almost as if it never even happened. I don't know where that thing went, but I promise you, it's still out there. When I was a kid living in Bandon out in Seven Devils Road, at the time there were lots of wooded areas. This was in the 80s, so I pretty much did whatever I wanted to during the summertime. I would pack a backpack with jerky and a sandwich or two and go out and play in the woods until dark. I was big into Rambo at the time, so I had my survival knife, a BB gun, a canteen, and camo. I would spend all day digging hidey holes and playing with them and coming in and out of cover like it was a war. Personally, I thought it was pretty awesome, but here's where things get weird. So one day near the end of summer, I hear my mom call out to me in the woods, which was weird because our house was the opposite direction from where the call came. So I hollered back to her and said, "I'm over here." I went toward the sound of her voice. This happened a few more times and I kept following. At this point, I was getting a little freaked out because there was no reason for my mom to be out in the woods. In fact, she hated the woods. She never stepped foot in them. So I turned around and started to go back the way I came. Then the calls came out again, but this time her voice was really angry, so I took off running. I heard her call my name a few more times as I was bolting back toward home. I was getting really tired from pushing through the bushes and undergrowth, and it sounded like it was getting closer. I finally made it back to an area I was really familiar with, and I needed a breather. I hopped into one of my hidey holes and covered it up real quick, and I sat there quietly. About a minute later, the steps got much louder. Whoever was behind me was really close. They didn't talk anymore, though. I could see a little bit from my hole, so I was watching. Sure enough, I saw someone in a pair of boots and blue jeans pass by. Whoever it was went straight past me, and I sat there for what felt like forever. When I felt like it was safe, I covered my hidey hole back up and bolted to my house. My dad had just gotten home and I told him what had happened. Being the 80s, he told me if I was lying, he was going to whoop me silly and had me take him out to where I was. Sure enough, there were boot prints where I was hiding, and whoever made the prints had doubled back and went back into the woods. He called a few buddies of his and they followed the tracks for a while, but lost the trail pretty soon after that. My brother and I weren't allowed to go back into the woods anymore after that, and eventually we ended up moving. The person following me isn't really what freaked me out. What freaked me out was whoever was calling to me sounded just like my mom. And what freaked me out even more than that is that the person knew my name. I grew up in the sticks on the Oregon coast, and I'd ride my bike miles through the woods on those old logging roads. Most had been pretty much overgrown, but you could still find a trail. You just had to knock some stuff out of the way, so it made a little bit of racket, but it was passable. One time when I was maybe 12 years old, I was going down this one trail that I'd probably been down maybe 40 or 50 times, and I heard something. I don't really know what it was, just weird sounds in the woods. Guttural sounds, but almost like a melody. Like I was trying to talk, but couldn't. Snarling, growling, but not growling. It freaked me out to the point that I decided to turn back home. And this damn thing followed me for 2.5 miles. I couldn't shake it, whatever it was. Everywhere I went, it would start a few seconds after I would start, and stop a few seconds after I stopped. If I rode fast, it would follow me pretty much the same speed, even down relatively long, steep hills. If I stopped to walk my bike, it would follow at roughly a walking pace. It was definitely quieter than I was, but I could still hear it. It was creeping through the woods. I could hear it walking. I could hear it making these same strange sounds that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. I called out to it. It said nothing, and I never saw it. Finally, I came back out onto a decent-sized road, and it stopped following me. I never heard it again in the handful of years that I lived in that area. I'd seen plenty of bears. The bears down there would take off like a shot when they heard someone or spotted someone. I've heard cougars in the woods before as well, and it definitely wasn't a cougar or a bobcat. And it wasn't an echo from me moving. The sounds didn't quite match, and there really wasn't anything to echo off of. All I know is that I've never felt terror quite like that again.